Hello everyone and welcome to this podcast. I'm Dr. Brett Heasman and today, along with some of my co-authors, we're going to be exploring psychological flow. Now you may be familiar with the term flow. It's used to describe a very deep focus within an activity, such that other things like time and space and sense of self can pass by unnoticed. All people experience flow, however, we're going to be asking some specific questions about the connection between the intense focus involved in flow and aspects of autistic experiences. Specifically, we're going to explore how can the concept of psychological flow provide alternative insights into autistic ways of being, and how might we develop a theory of autistic flow to help us build enabling environments that allow autistic people to flourish. We explore these questions in our new paper, Towards Autistic Flow Theory, a Non-pathologising Approach. And you'll find a link to this in the description below. I'll introduce my co-authors. We'll start with Gemma. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about why you're interested in flow?
Yeah, hi. So I'm Dr. Gemma Williams. I am autistic and my PhD research was looking at communication between autistic and non-autistic speakers from a kind of linguistics perspective. And I think through that research, seeing the ways in which flow was established in interaction, it sort of really caught my interest. And from a personal perspective, I think being involved in a lot of music and working with other musicians, you often find that you get into these sort of shared creative flow states. So it's always been something that's sort of, been a bit of a background interest.
Thanks, Gemma. Over to you, Lorna.
Hi, my name's Dr. Lorna Hamilton. I'm a developmental psychologist, and a lot of my research has been working directly with autistic and other neurodivergent pupils in school, trying to take quite a holistic approach and understand perspectives of the young person directly using sort of creative, accessible methods alongside their families and teachers. And the more work I've done in that vein, the more thoughts I've had about the mismatch, I guess, between autistic young people's abilities and the way that they're able to absorb in areas of specialist interest when they're in environments that feel comfortable and safe, and what happens in educational settings, which tends to perhaps not naturally induce flow states because there's a constant sort of change and demands on children's executive function and so on, which can be really difficult, I think, for autistic and neurodivergent pupils. And so began to think about, how learning, how teaching could be different for autistic pupils in order to optimize, the fantastic abilities that the young people I work with have that aren't always, I guess, seen in the educational system.
Thanks, Lorna. And over to you, Fergus.
I'm Fergus Murray. I'm a autistic writer, science teacher, and community organizer. Similar to Lorna, the role of flow in education is super interesting to me. I remember in my own school days, the times when I learned the best was when I was allowed to really get into things. And I have seen as a teacher how little of the time that's facilitated for students. And I've had interesting experiences working in different alternative education provisions. I've been working at a Montessori school, which there is some research suggesting that kids spend a lot more of their time in flow states in Montessori schools, typically. I wish I was more confident that we're achieving that at my current school with the cohort that I'm working with, which is older kids. But it's a very interesting and difficult problem.
Brilliant. Thanks, Fergus. And then I guess myself, as I said, I'm Dr. Brett Heasman. I'm a social psychologist, and I became really interested in flow during my PhD when I was working at a charity that supports young autistic adults. And I became really interested in the interactions taking place around activities, in particular video gaming. And I was interested because it was not what the literature sort of says should happen, in the sense that there was so much social rapport, so much banter, so much exchanging of ideas, exchanging of perspectives, supporting each other. All these social skills were going on in this particular environment. So I ended up doing this study where I looked at trying to understand what are these patterns of social relating that are going on in this environment. And it really highlighted, essentially what I was doing was starting to develop an understanding of what's known as intersubjective flow. So how people form connections with each other and then build that shared understanding. And then as my thesis went on, I started to develop ideas, which I'm still developing now, which is I think we put a very normative lens on what counts as social interaction, when actually there's just interaction, and sometimes it can align with social goals and sometimes not. And so a lot of my PhD ended up looking at kind of the problems of applying this normative lens of what counts as social onto things. And one of the things that came out of my study as well was looking at the way in which people would go off individually to problem solve and then come back together. And that was kind of a really good example of people slipping into individual flow and then coming back together to form intersubjective flow. And so I started to realize that this question of flow was way more important than I realized. It wasn't just about people finding novel ways to connect with each other, but they're also finding novel ways to connect with the world. And if you have an environment that supports the freedom for people to switch between the two, then actually you're developing a really good environment that can allow people with different communicative styles, different interaction styles to really flourish. But most environments we have don't really allow that very well. They kind of force you to just interact with each other according to some conventions, and to ignore someone else and go off and explore something independently is seen as an antisocial thing to do. So we'll move on and talk just briefly about some of the background of this paper and what it's about, and then we'll go on and have some discussion about some of the really interesting things that came up in the paper. So we've talked a lot about this term flow, and this paper is about flow states and autism, which are two areas of research that are coming together and have been coming together for some time. And what we're trying to do with this paper is we're looking ahead to really consider how we might bring these literatures together in a way that's scientifically and ethically rigorous with the underlying principles at play. So flow states are a body of psychological literature that has explored what happens when we become really absorbed in an activity. Specifically, when we're absorbed in an activity of interest, we start to lose awareness of time and space around us. We lose awareness of our own sense of self. And at the same time, we have an increase in all these other feelings of self-control, feeling of enjoyment about what we're doing, serenity, clarity, and motivation. So what's really interesting about the flow states literature is that it comes from positive psychology. So what that means is it's looking at optimal states of being in the world. And it's very much focused on trying to release our potential as humans. Yet the same criteria that's used to describe flow states in a positive way, so this idea of being able to fixate on something of interest for a long period of time, is actually one of the diagnostic criterion for autism. And so we have the same behavior in one literature, which is seen as a strength, but in another literature is pathologized as a symptom. So the surrounding context to this is that, there's a long history of research about autism, which has done quite poor theorization. And this has been to the detriment of autistic people. And specifically, it has theorized from a normative standpoint. So it's looked at what social behavior should be according to norms rather than what it could be according to natural diversity of interactional styles. And within this whole process, the autistic voice hasn't been valued. Now, over the last 15 to 20 years, we have seen a strong emergence of a neurodiversity approach, which doesn't see difference as a deficit, but does rather see it as part of natural human variation. However, despite this, we do still see bad theorization, and it emerges from a lack of critical reflection and inclusion of autistic voice within psychological science, which itself is a very broad field. So in essence, what this paper is doing is it's delving deep into aspects of psychological theory, and it's trying to highlight the value that flow states would bring to autism studies, the opportunities for investigations that it opens up, but also the reasons why, if we pathologize flow states in the context of autism, this would violate some of the underlying principles of flow states theory itself. So that's why we have the title of our paper is Towards Autistic Flow Theory, a Non-Pathologizing Approach. Okay, so that's my intro, which leads us to then go in and talk about the paper. So one of the things that I've already mentioned is that these two literatures have been coming together, and they have been coming together for some time. Flow states in autism is not a new idea, and autistic people have been using flow to describe lived experience for some time. And we've also had theorization from autistic scholars about aspects of flow as well. So I'd like to open this up to my co-authors to talk a bit about some of this background history of flow in autism research. Fergus, would you like to go first?
Sure, yeah. So when I talked earlier about my interest in flow, I probably should have mentioned monotropism, which is originally a theory of autism that my mum developed, Dinah Murray, together with Wen Lawson and Mike Lesser, which essentially suggests that the basic difference with autistic people and non-autistic people is that autistic people tend to focus attention and other processing resources on a smaller number of things at a time. And when you look at descriptions of flow states, they overlap very heavily with descriptions of monotropism. So it's significant that monotropism was developed by 3 autistic scholars who looked at what people were saying about autism and found it deeply unsatisfactory. Like you said, there is a long history of poor theorizing about autism, which has failed to take into account autistic perspectives, really tried to look at what we look like from the outside and theorize based on that, which is not the best approach when it's also possible to communicate with people about their own experiences. So yeah, Dinah spent 3 decades of her life really thinking about autism. About halfway through, maybe a bit less, she realized she was autistic herself, but her work was a lot about listening to autistic people, learning from autistic people. She became a support worker in order to meet more autistic people and hear about their experiences and see whether monotropism panned out as a comprehensive theory of autistic experience, which I think so far it seems to, but it has not been empirically explored as much as it should be. Her last paper was The Human Spectrum with Damien Milton, who's a co-author on this as well, and Jonathan Green and Jo Bavoots, how I think you say it. Anyway, so yeah, Damien has been a leading autethnographer. He comes from a sociology background and has applied anthropological tools to the stuff, written with great insight about his own experiences. And I think he's probably the first person who I'm aware of talking about autism and flow states, which has come more and more to the fore. I'm not sure if I've said anything terribly insightful. there are some things, a bit of historical context.
Yeah, no, it's really good, and it's really good to understand more about Dinah's thinking as well, and how that came into being. And it was such a big part of writing the paper as well. This idea that there are different attentional patterns is really important to sort of the discovery of flow and the intensity of experiences around flow when it takes place.
So the sensory dimension feels for me like an important crossover, because it was spoken about a little bit in the highly original stuff about flow, but it was more, for me it seemed like it was more a side point, like, oh, you can get to it through sensory experiencing, but I think for autistic people it's much more dominant. So obviously, autistic people tend to have these divergent sensory profiles, and often can have like heightened sensory reactions, to any number of the external senses as well as the internal senses. And I think when we were looking through some of the autobiographical accounts from autistic people, often you see or hear these descriptions of really kind of joyful, heightened sensory experiences of engaging with the world around them. And so it seems like these kind of, maybe more intense sensory experiences provide extra routes into flow for autistic people and autistic ways of being. I think we spoke about like the role of stimming as well, is sort of the autistic behavior or trait of like using repeated action and movement or sounds to sort of as a way of self-regulating, and how perhaps this is a kind of inducing of a flow state to help manage external overstimulation or a kind of chaotic sensory environment.
Very interesting, yeah. So I guess we've sort of touched upon the two key aspects of this sort of overlap between flow and autism in terms of monotropic attention states, and then the sensory dimension as well. And it made me just sort of think I should have given a bit more context, in the sense that flow states are experienced by everyone. It's a natural part of how you navigate a confusing world around you, is that you need to zone in and focus on particular things and forget everything else in order to really apply yourself. But what's interesting here is that perhaps there are strengths in finding flow that autistic people have because of their attentional pattern, which can go deep very fast on particular things. And the sensory connection to the environment means that the discovery of flow is much faster. So these were two sort of really interesting starting points for our discussion about, this study of flow is actually really important in this context. Yeah. Did anyone want to come in? Lorna, you want to say something there?
Yeah, just briefly, and following on from your points about the sort of evolution of theory, Brett and Fergus, something that I've really noticed is children, when they learn they're autistic and go through the diagnostic process, they're faced with these two really competing discourses around what it means to be autistic. Some of the traditional psychological theories that we're all familiar with and, have critiqued in the paper for the, whether they're either necessary or sufficient to explain the really wide diversity that we see in autism. And also these lived experience accounts that have been coming through autistic communities for decades and are making it into sort of the common discourse. And in recent years, sort of as a university educator, I've seen a huge uptick in the number of autistic and neurodivergent students we have, and they're already talking in terms of flow states and monotropic attentional styles, because they're accessing these discourses through autistic community spaces. So I guess I'm saying that I really don't think that the psychological community can ignore this. The two worlds have to come together, and we have to start theorising in the light of autistic lived experience accounts.
Brilliant, thanks, Lorna. In our paper, what we do is we look at accounts from autistic people, first of all, to see where the patterns of flow are, discussing some of these aspects in particular of monotropism and sensory connection, and also interpersonal flow. There were some parts as well where we talked about autistic inertia. I don't know, Gemma, if you wanted to expand a bit about that aspect of flow as well.
Yeah, so there's this term autistic inertia, which, again, like Lorna said, it's a term that comes up sort of in autistic communities and in the kind of discourse, but it's not really been spoken about a lot in academic literature yet. Though a few papers are starting to talk about it, but it's this idea that autistic people can often experience a real difficulty in either initiating an activity or a state or exiting it. So there's a sense of like being deeply immersed in an activity or a moment, but then really disabling aspect to it where you can't exit and you can't stop. So yeah, we were looking at how that related to sort of almost like being trapped in a flow state. So yeah, you get sort of anecdotal descriptions of people maybe like being really engrossed in playing a video game or drawing or doing the thing that's giving them this sort of feedback, and they're in this flow state with, but perhaps they really need to go to the toilet and they can't stop what they're doing, or they're really hungry, or
Yeah, thanks, Gemma. And I think another thing you're highlighting there is the environment, the extent to which it supports or inhibits flow, and that could be part of the inertia process, I guess. Sometimes the environment's forcing you to change task or stop flow, or it's preventing you from finding the flow. what was really interesting looking at autistic accounts is the awareness of how environment supports flow and the attempts to adapt one's environment to make flow more conducive. I think that's so fascinating because there's clearly a wealth of expertise and knowledge there that if we could understand better, we could design more enabling environments in other contexts as well. Something else which we're now starting to touch on are some of the conceptual challenges. Flow state is a theory that has some ambiguities or some areas of further consideration, which is why this mapping of flow into autism studies needs some critical reflection. One of them is this idea that it's an optimal state, which, as you've just described, sometimes the process of being really absorbed can have some detrimental effects, but also this idea of it being dynamic. Flow states is actually kind of not a helpful word. A state sounds like something that's fixed or static. And I think one of the things we looked at was there have been attempts by theorists of flow to develop more dynamic models that tell us something about how people get into and out of flow, which is a question that's extremely relevant for understanding how to support autistic people, particularly with regards to inertia or sensory connectedness, etc. So I think that's something that needs more investigation, are these dynamic models, and that's why one of our recommendations is to focus on transitions into and out of flow. And then, this idea that it's not always an optimal state. Something else which we haven't touched on is the original conceptualization of flow came from cognitive psychology. It came from a framework that was very much interested in a balance between skills of the individual and demands of the environment. And when we were looking at autistic accounts to see that this criteria doesn't always fit so well. It fits sometimes, but not all the time. It's not always about matching skills with one's environment, which led to another aspect of our paper, which was to say, yes, there's this great overlap between flow and autism, but maybe there's some qualitative difference as well. Maybe the type of flow that autistic people experience has some unique qualitative properties about it. And we began to explore what some of those might be. So one idea was this idea of well-being. Flow's already linked to good feelings, enjoyment, etc. But clearly from the accounts we were looking at, flow's more than just feeling good in the moment. It's also an escape from potentially an overstimulating or problematic world elsewhere. It's actually quite a vital source of catharsis. So that means that the role of flow has a much greater prominence for well-being.
I remember when I was first learning about autism, I didn't know anything about it, and I had my diagnosis. Some of the stereotypical descriptions are that autistic people have difficulty with transitions, and I think that is true. But I just wonder if there's any parallel between this, like the inertia and difficulty transitioning between being in flow states and being out of it. If you kind of grow up learning that it's painful to kind of evict yourself from a flow state, then all transitions might start feeling a little bit frightening.
That really resonates with the work that we've done with autistic pupils in school, Gemma. The periods of distress are often around those periods of transition, whether it's between lessons or getting ready to go to school in the morning when the child might have been really immersed in the music, or one young man I was thinking of, was a huge expert in politics and international relations, who'd been reading about that in the morning and then sort of leaving that in order to do everything that was needed to get ready for school was distressing. I do definitely see those parallels between sort of diagnostic criteria around difficulty with transition and the lived reality, I think, of having external factors enforcing almost an exit from a flow state in a state of sort of intense interest.
And I think this is somewhere that non-autistic people can gain some insight into autistic experiences by looking at their own flow states, because being torn out of a flow state is really pretty horrible for everyone, as I understand it. So almost everyone has had an experience of, they're almost at the end of a chapter and someone calls them away and they have to leave it, or like a sports game is almost finished, or they're nearly at the end of a level and then someone insists that they go and do something else. So Yeah, I say to people who work with autistic kids or who have autistic family members that if they want to understand why life feels so destabilizing for the autistic people in their lives, imagine that is happening to you multiple times every day, and try and find ways to make it happen less for the autistic people that you care about or work with.
Flow has a lot of advantages. It provides a contextualized understanding of behavior because it's looking at an individual within an activity connected to their environment. Whereas other models of understanding autism have been quite abstract or individualized and are looking only internally at the individual. So there's a strength here to do with validity, but it's also non-pathologizing because at its core, it considers flow to be a strength, that this is a natural part of what makes us humans. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who developed the theory, was fascinated by how people organize their life into really concentrated forms. So things like a theatre, it's a physical structure, but it's designed to concentrate your attention on one particular space of activity, to the point that you forget about everything else. And so this is an integral feature of human life, but it's also a strength. And one of the things we try to guard against, particularly given the history of bad theorization, is the idea that people might look at flow and focus perhaps only on negatives in the context of autism and forget that what we're saying is there's a strength here to be harnessed. There's a potential that finding flow quickly and developing environments that support flow, you could unlock a lot of potential there.
Yes, I would totally agree, and it really chimes. And yes, I think as an educator, I'm constantly mindful of the way that our systems, our structures and processes and just inherited ways of doing things, which it's easier not to question and just to carry on with because this is the way things have always been done, can be really limiting. In my case, students, undergraduate students who have immense potential and bring huge skill and wealth of funds of knowledge to the table, but they're just not enabled to reach their full potentiality because we insist that they switch between topics all the time, or that they present their knowledge in a certain way. I think there is real scope here, and it is being done given what we've seen in this country, certainly around the attendance crisis in schools, and the evidence suggesting that a huge proportion of those children who aren't in schools are neurodivergent. So families are doing it for themselves. They're finding ways of allowing children to be more self-directed in their learning, to bring greater autonomy to the learning process and allow them to pursue the things that they're intrinsically interested in, because without that sort of deep dive focus, intrinsic motivation to find everything out about a given subject, that's how knowledge progresses, that's how society progresses. And if we're constantly inhibiting that because of the structures we're imposing on people, that's just a real shame. I'm hopeful that there's some alternative ways of education that we can discover, we can facilitate to enable autistic and other neurodivergent talents and strengths to thrive. Yeah.
And probably not just autistic and neurodivergent people. Like, actually, self-directed learning is an incredibly powerful, which our education system as a whole just not set up for. And it's kind of funny because it is in the primary years to a large extent. Young kids are encouraged to do what seems interesting to them a lot of the time. And then you get to like university level and you're back at that, where then we've got this sort of 8 to 10 years in the middle where kids have almost no autonomy. Very few opportunities for self-directed learning. I don't think it's great for anyone. And there've been a lot of efforts to try and change it over the years. And it's interesting how the pandemic seems to have sort of forced a lot of people's hands. People are trying home education and self-directed education as part of that because they had no other choice, which means there are a lot more eyes on that. A lot more people thinking along those lines, which is great to see. And it's nice that it's coinciding with this current in autism research in particular.
Yeah, and in an ideal world, it wouldn't be necessary for families to do it themselves in their home, which is obviously not ideal for everyone in terms of parents working and all the rest of it. Ideally, the education system will take on some of these ideas around self-directed learning so that there's greater flexibility and greater choice in the ways that we educate our young people.
I think, both of you have said that self-directed learning is an important and fruitful way of working for everyone, not just neurodivergent young people. And maybe that's part of what, as Brett was saying, flow states comes from positive psychology. Flow states are a beneficial tool for anyone, for learning, for thriving and flourishing.
This brings us back to the sensory thing, because sensorily busy environments, again, are not great for a lot of people, and they're stopping people from entering flow states. It's not just the structure or the timetable of the school day or the determination to shove exam-based knowledge into kids' heads that is stopping people from entering flow states. It's the sensory environment as well. And again, that's something that a lot of benefit from more attention being paid to.
Yeah. So in the paper, we talk about how we can use flow theory to inform the developments of environments that allow autistic people to flourish, and specifically within education. But it's a really nice point that this works for everyone. And just to follow up on your point, Fergus, as well, I mean, as a teacher yourself, I'm a lecturer, and we're also prevented from being in flow when we're teaching. So it's not just the students, is it? It's the teachers, because there are all these frameworks around us and all these different pressures which are inhibitors to flow. So that's also a challenge as well. Is a kind of institutional, infrastructural frameworks that people are trying to navigate, and then somehow within the middle of all of that cultivate some sense of flow with each other. Okay, so that brings together our thoughts for this first episode on psychological flow. Thank you to my co-authors for joining me, and we'll be back soon with further episodes.